Sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well.
Very good evening to everyone. If you'd like to, we'll give you another couple of minutes just to take your seats. Sorry. Right, very warm welcome this evening to Lansdowne. There's a great turnout tonight, really good to see on what's been a lovely day. I'm Peter Brown, I'm one of the elders here at Lansdowne, and this evening is the start of a new series of big questions, and we do it in a very different format. For many of you are aware of the big questions format. On a monthly basis, we run this. Michael Otts, he talks about some of the real issues, some of the real factors about our Christian faith. They're often a real block to people. And when we're chatting with people, they are often the questions that people ask. So helpful for Michael to answer some of those questions. Michael speaks for about 30 minutes. During that time, he'll be interviewing Andy Mayo. Andy Mayo, who will be doing the music tonight. Andy's a real old friend of Lansdowne, has been down to Lansdowne over a number of years. Andy's a jazz musician, lives in London, has a number of other roles, and I know Michael will be interviewing him later just to find out a little bit more about Andy. So Michael will speak for about 30 minutes on the very difficult subject, war and terrorism. How much is religion to blame? So again, a lot of people looking at a lot of the issues that are happening around the world at the moment. A very delicate issue, and I know Michael will answer a lot of those questions, which are very important. So Michael will speak for about 30 minutes. There'll be then opportunities to ask questions. There'll be a number, top right-hand corner of the screen, which you can text questions to that number. There are sheets on your chairs that you can fill in with questions. And then what we do after a 5-minute break is to actually go through the questions, and I will present those to Michael, and he will answer them on the spot. So a real opportunity there for you to put some of those key questions you've got on that subject to him tonight. Okay, Michael, come on up, and we'll just find out. As I say, the last time that we held the big questions was in June. Cue the microphone. What have you been doing last 3 months?
Working out how to use a microphone by the just sound of things. That's not good, is it? No. Scrap that one. Battling with PA systems. What have I been doing the last few months? I've actually been here a bit more than normal. And many of you know I travel different parts of Europe and travel quite widely, but because I work with university students, and the summer obviously people are not at university, it gives me an opportunity to be in Bournemouth a bit, which has been nice. During that time, I've been able to do some work, have some holiday, and I was also involved in a camp. I've been in a conference in Kyrgyzstan and a few things like that.
So the opportunity to enjoy sunny Bournemouth.
Absolutely.
What is absolutely beautiful time of year. And I know you've done a couple of postings about beach huts not being there that you use on a regular basis, but we can move on from that. But great. So we look forward to you giving us your talk now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, good evening and welcome. If you're here for the first time for a Big Questions evening, then especially warm welcome to you. Great to have you with us as well this evening, and hope that you'll feel that you're able to come back for other ones throughout the year as well. As Pete said, the number's going to be on the corner of the screen throughout the evening, and so please do feel free to text in as we go through, and as we said, we'll deal with as many of those at the end of the evening as possible. But we're looking at this question: how much is religion to blame for the war and terrorism in our world today? Just 15 years ago and a week, This event happened, 15th anniversary was just last Sunday. And I'm sure most of us can remember where we were on that day, when the world seemed to change forever with those events that took place on 9/11. And the world has been a different place since then. Sadly, that wasn't the end of the terrorism and violence that can be caused by religion. Of course, here in Britain, we had our own 7/7 not long afterwards. The rise of ISIS and all of the horrific things that have gone on. You remember those traumatic pictures of 21 Christians on the beach in Libya, beheaded by ISIS. Or this really shocked me, the beheading of this young man for simply listening to pop music in Mosul in Iraq. And then the Paris attacks, and the many there who were killed, or even more recently, the terrible lorry attack in Nice. Remember, of course, the terror attacks in Belgium. I was there just a few weeks after that in Belgium. And actually, just 1 week before this terror attack, I was in that airport in Istanbul. And so that came home very personally to me. And then, of course, it's not simply confined to Europe. The missing girls in Nigeria, taken by Boko Haram. The 147 Christian students in Kenya killed in the attacks at Garissa University. The list goes on, doesn't it? And they're just the ones that make the Western media. And yet, of course, it isn't just Muslims that have, through history, caused violence. Other nations and other groups have too. Just a few years ago, I was here in Sarajevo. It, of course, wasn't like that when I was there. Thankfully, it had been rebuilt. But I was reminded of the terrible siege of Sarajevo, the longest siege in modern warfare, 3.5 years. The mainly Muslim inhabitants of that city were surrounded and besieged by the Christian nation of Serbia, or those who would have called themselves Christian. And then, of course, even closer to home, the troubles in Northern Ireland and the conflict there that would be perceived to be religious in motivation. But it's not just post 9/11, is it? We've got other things that have happened. People will talk about the Crusades. What about the record of the church through history? What do we make of that? It does seem, doesn't it, that religion has been responsible for a lot of suffering and violence. And so we want to look at that tonight. And before we do, I'm going to ask Andy to come and join me. Andy, come and join me, because not only are you a musician, and we're going to hear you sing tonight, but you lived actually for a number of years, didn't you, in the Balkans. So tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Well, that's true. The Balkans really became my home for a number of years. The war there really shattered what was seen by everyone outside as one nation. And it turned out to be a number of different ethnic groups who split and started a civil war fighting against each other. And of course, it wasn't just infrastructure that was damaged or towns torn apart, but people's lives. And these are photographs that I took as I shared time with different people there. This old school gym, where mold's now growing on the wall, was a place where refugees flooded to try and make a temporary home there, and ended up staying there for many years. I went there traveling out with an Oak Hall coach. It was an Oak Hall project to take humanitarian aid out there. I was at university when those journeys began, and we would meet people with horrific stories to tell, and they would describe some of the things that they had been through. This is one person who I got to know, and he described to me how he had grown up like many of us, going to school and then college. Everyone had to do their army service out there, so he was seen as a potential leader and was sent off to be trained as an officer, so that if ever he was needed, he could be called up to the Yugoslav army. But then he went home to his village, and suddenly the civil war began. And everybody turned to him and said, "Hey, Sinisha, you know you know these things. You've got to be in charge of defense of our town." And Sinisha was trying to organize this ragtag bunch of people in their village against these different attacks that were coming. He described how time after time, friends of his would be cut down by a sniper or by a rocket-propelled grenade coming into this besieged village. And everybody's eyes were on Sinisha. Sinisha, you're going to save us. And one day, with his knowledge of how front lines moved and the strength of the other side, how it was growing and growing, he knew that the next day they were all going to be annihilated. There was no possibility of future. And he goes around the men trying to encourage them that to stand in their positions, to hold the line. And then he goes himself down into a bunker and he stands there and he thinks, tomorrow all these people who I'm supposed to be protecting are going to be dead. I've been telling them to hold the line, but there's no way we can hold the line. The numbers of people the other side are just growing and growing, and I can see that tomorrow we're going to be utterly overrun. And he finds himself in that bunker, utterly broken, thinking, what kind of future have we got because of this insane civil war that's breaking up our country? Another friend, just briefly, his name is Jelemir, and it means man who wants peace. And he was also drafted. And as he sees just the horror of the civil war breaking out and unfolding around him, he just went insane. And he found himself in the middle of the town square. I stood there later, and he just stood there with his automatic rifle, and just fired it off all around this square, the town square in the south of Bosnia. He was arrested, chained down to a bed, pumped with drugs, and this man, he's just lost his mind because of the evil of this civil war unfolding around him. Two friends. Well, later, as Michael said, rather than just visiting from time to time as that war was continuing, it became our home. I'd now married a girl called Faye, who'd grown up in a sweet village in Kent, and she then came with me 2 years after we got married out to live in the Balkans. But all sorts of things continued during those days, and I wanted to sing you a song that's just a picture, really, of one of those moments. And this moment is me sitting in a cafe and sitting in what should be just a normal town green, but instead there's been bombing over these last weeks and months, and it's been relentless. But now there's a moment where the bombing's stopped, and it seems like peace might come. And as I'm just sitting at this little table and just gazing out, just enjoying this moment of peace, this little girl comes out of a bombed out building, and she's holding on to her grandfather's hand, and this very short song is just like a snapshot of that moment. It's called Princess in the Park. The princess in the park, she holds his hand and steps across the green. And her white dress frills jump and sway as she skips and walks. She's 5 years old. She shines against the cold grey, frowning landscape of bombed out buildings in the downtown parade. She's the princess in the park, and everyone turns to smile at her. They smile at her innocence, her joyful insistence to smell the orange flowers that grow between the paving, to point at the pigeon, to laugh at the old man who holds her hand.
She's the princess in the park. She's the princess in the park.
Thanks so much, Andy. We're going to hear more from Andy later. Well, what do we do in the face of a world that's torn apart by ethnic and religious violence? What's the solution to it? Well, many people would suggest that the solution to such a problem would be just to get rid of religion. Surely, if we could get rid of religion, we would get rid of those things that divide. John Lennon, perhaps most famously, put it in one of his songs, Imagine. Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Can't we just get rid of religion? Imagine a world with no religion. Surely the conflict in the Balkans would have never happened. Richard Dawkins picked up on that theme when he said this in his famous book, The God Delusion. He said, imagine with John Lennon a world with no religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts, no gunpowder plots, no Indian partition, no Israeli-Palestinian wars, no Serb-Croat Muslim massacres, no persecution of Jews as Christ killers, no shiny bouffant-haired televangelists fleecing gullible people of their money because God wants you to give till it hurts. Imagine no Taliban to blow up ancient statues, no public beheadings of blasphemers, no flogging of female skin for the crime of showing just an inch of it. Imagine a world with no religion. Wouldn't it be a better world? Christopher Hitchens put it this way. He said, religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to human survival. Or Sam Harris says, religion is the most prolific source of violence in our history. But actually, it's not just the new atheists that have noticed this theme. Even back to the French mathematician Blaise Pascal, he said, men never do evil so cheerfully and completely as when they do it from religious conviction. So is religion the problem? Surely if we got rid of religion, got rid of God, we'd get rid of the problem. This came up on my Facebook feed the other day. Militant Islamist, militant Christianist, militant atheist. Surely, if we got rid of God, the worst that would happen is we would have some debates over a beer. Isn't that what would be the best solution? Maybe that's what you think tonight. Maybe you think we'd just be better off without all of this religious stuff. Well, as we look at this, I really want to just say a few things in response as we try and look at it. And the first is this. Not all wars are caused by religion. I know it can seem that way, can't it? Particularly the way that we look at our world today and the things that are going on. But actually, when you look at the statistics, they can tell quite a different story. This book that came out quite recently, the Encyclopedia of Wars, tracks 1,763 wars throughout the history of the human race. And of those 1,763, only 123 were actually caused by religious motivation. And actually, just over half of those were Islamic wars, the other half other religions. The vast majority of wars through history, the statistics show, were not religiously motivated. And actually, if you look back just at our last century, think of those that caused some of the greatest suffering and pain, and they were not religious at all. So Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, and Chairman Mao, between them, responsible for the deaths of over 100 million people in just the last century. Now, of course, some people would say at this point, well, it's got nothing to do with the fact that they were atheistic. It was just incidental that they were atheistic. And of course, I'd want to say, of course, there are many atheists in the world that are appalled by what these people did. But actually, are we too quick to dismiss any potential link? Viktor Frankl was a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And he writes this, fascinatingly, about what happened and his experience. He said, the gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of hereditary and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of the nihilistic scientists and philosophers. In other words, what he's saying is, actually, if your philosophy says that all we are is meaningless atoms held in suspension and nothing more, then what does it matter if we liquidate some of them? He saw a link between the philosophy that some people had and the actions that they perpetrated. And what's undoubtable is that Hitler and Stalin were both inspired by philosophers, Marx and Nietzsche, who were very atheistic in their thinking. Now again, I want to say this. There are many, many atheists in the world that are appalled by what they did and do great good. But my question would be, what is it about the philosophical system of atheism that actually makes us realize that what they did is ultimately and absolutely wrong? And what would guard against it? So that's the first thing. Not all wars are caused by religion. That's worth remembering. The second is this, that not all religious people cause violence. Often the way that religion is presented in particularly the Western media is simply as a source of violence and evil in our world. I'm guessing there's maybe two reasons for that. The first is that bad news always sells better than good news. So the news that we get of religion, if it's not first-hand, if it's through the media, is normally going to be bad. That's the way it works, sadly. But it may also be that actually it's convenient because it tells a story that we want to hear. It kind of makes us feel better about dismissing religion if we can see it simply as a thing responsible for evil and violence. But there is another side to the story, isn't there? I remember seeing this just a few years ago coming from Egypt. It was a tweet, and it was showing Muslim men standing guard around a Catholic church to protect them. There had been a number of attacks of Catholic Christians in that country. And they were standing guard to protect them from the attacks that could come. And of course, through the history of Christianity, there have been examples of Christians who have done great good in the world. Perhaps one of the most famous, William Wilberforce, who used his political position to campaign throughout his whole life for the abolition of slavery, convinced that every person, whatever their skin color, whatever their background and nation, had rights. Or more recently, Martin Luther King in his campaign against racism institutionalized in America. Or Desmond Tutu in his tireless work in South Africa, bringing reconciliation and peace. Perhaps less known for his Christian commitments, although actually a Christian, Nelson Mandela, who, inspired by his Christian conviction, wanted to show that love and forgiveness to others. He quite deliberately didn't shout out about his Christian commitments, but it was there in the background. Or if you're Scottish, here's a famous Scottish Christian lady, Mary Slessor. And if you've ever got a £10 note in Scotland, you may have looked at her, even if you didn't realize it. Mary Slessor, from the slums of Scotland, went out to Africa and spent her life working for the good of people in that continent. And in particular, helping stop the evil practice of killing newborn twins because of the superstitious ideas that some had that newborn twins would somehow be kind of demonic. And so she stopped that practice. And of course, there are many other stories. Those who started schools and hospitals in this country, many of them were Christians, hence the names behind some of them. The abolition of child labor, inspired by Christians. Even, I like this one, the invention of a lot of breweries. Now that might sound a surprise to some of us, but I was reading about this recently, that historically, actually, people drank more gin than they did beer. And of course, you don't have to drink much gin to get very drunk. And so some Christians, to try and prevent this, started breweries to encourage people to drink beer rather than gin. So the invention of many breweries has Christians to thank. Christians have had influence through history. Christians have done good. And we need to see that side of the story too. And I think it's a shame, isn't it, when people like Dawkins and others can only see one side of the story. But you might say, well, which side of the story is most convincing? And who are being the most consistent? If religion is a mixed bag of good and evil, what is the true face of religion? Well, we're going to explore that question in a moment, but before we do, Andy's going to come and he's going to sing us another song.
I wrote this song just after seeing a film. And this film was reflecting on this kind of burden that all of us seem to carry, whether we're living in a war zone or not. A burden and a sense that perhaps there might be some way that what is wrong in my heart, what is causing me to do things that break things, could be taken away. And this song's called Is There a Place? Is there a place where I could be forgiven? Is there a place where I could be free? Is there a place of no condemnation? Is there a place for someone like me? Is there a way my wrong could be passed over? Is there a way to lose it in the deepest sea? Is there a way that I could touch heaven? Or is there a way that heaven could come to me? I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I hear your voice and it whispers to me. I hear your voice and it echoes in my soul. I hear the voice of loving liberation. I hear the voice of the one who waits to make me whole. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I hear your voice and it whispers to me.
Thanks, Andy. So we've seen that the record of religion is mixed, isn't it? It can be responsible for evil. It can be responsible for good. But what are we to do with that? Well, you could understand, couldn't you, if as a Christian I would want to highlight the good that religious people and Christians in particular have done. And of course you could understand, couldn't you, why some atheists would want to highlight the negative sides of religion and what religious people have done. But what is the true face of religion? Or maybe put it this way, when religious people do good things, were they doing those things in spite of what they believed or because of what they believed? Who's being the most consistent? And to answer that question, you need to go back to the source, don't you? You need to ask some deeper questions. Let me try and illustrate this if I can. Imagine for a minute that the staff team here at Lansdowne got a little bit bored with being the staff team at Lansdowne, and so they decided to try their hands to a little bit of an extracurricular pastime, and they form an ABBA tribute band, okay? So rather than coming for staff meeting tomorrow, they form this ABBA tribute band. Here they are. They've been practicing, getting the haircuts, and they are going to hit Bournemouth, okay, with their latest ABBA tribute act. And so they put up posters all around the estate here, on all the lampposts, saying ABBA tribute band coming up next Wednesday evening, 7:30 here. Now, most of us, we go around and we see the posters and we've heard Peter Baker trying to sing at the front of church completely out of time, and we realize that that is not going to be something that we want to go to, okay? We steer clear. We think of anything better to do next Wednesday than hearing these guys. But just imagine that next Wednesday there's a group of Mongolian tourists who turn up in Bournemouth. And they walk around and they see these posters for this tribute band and they say, well, let's go and find out what ABBA are really like. Let's go and hear the tribute band. So in they walk to Lansdowne Church, and they are, in fact, the only members of the audience. Peter gets up with Miles and Laura and Sean, and they start their rendition of Mamma Mia. And a few moments later, these Mongolian tourists are seen running down Woodbury Avenue very, very fast away from the church. And as they run, they shout to each other, ABBA are the worst band we have ever heard. Now, would they be correct in their conclusion? Well, in a sense, you could forgive them for it, couldn't you? They've heard a very bad representation of the original. Now, of course, what they could do is they could go to some other tribute bands. There are some out there, I do believe. And they could hear them. And they could listen to other people try and copy ABBA. But how would they know who was good and who was bad? Who was being best and who was being worst? They'd only be able to judge that if they actually listened to the original. If they went back to the original, they would know who was the best imitation of the real thing. And we have to do that with religion, don't we? We have to ask the question, who is being most consistent with the beliefs and the person that they claim to follow? Is it those who cause evil, or is it those who do good? And actually what you then have to realize is that when it comes to religion, religions are different in what they teach. We can't simply package all religions together and say they are the same, because they're not. They teach different things and believe different things. So you would have to do this. Obviously, we're not going to do it for every religious system tonight, but I just want to look at two. Islam, because that is the one that is currently in the media most in relation to this question. And then Christianity as a Christian and as a community of Christians. Obviously, that is particularly pertinent as a church. So let's ask the question firstly then, what about Islam? And what are we to make of it in this situation? Very often you hear people come up with sound bites like this: Islam means peace, or Islam is peace, in response to the violence that we see perpetrated. Recently, the President of America, Barack Obama, said this: ISIL, he said, is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. And so the Western media is very quick, isn't it, to distance any of these attacks from being anything to do with Islam itself. But actually, what very few people do is actually start to ask the questions of, well, what does the Quran teach? And what is going on here? Actually, the first thing that's worth saying is that when people use the expression Islam means peace, that's just not historically true. That's a very modern idea. It's not one that you would find going back through the history of Islam. The word doesn't mean peace. I guess you could argue that it means peace as a result of submission, but the word really means to submit. What do we find when we actually look at the center of Islamic teaching? Well, what you find is interesting. If you've read the Quran, I'm currently reading it at the moment, you find that there's a mixture of verses. You get verses like this in Surah 2, 256. There is no compulsion in religion. Sounds pretty peaceful. Or this: I do not worship what you worship, you do not worship what I worship, you have your religion and I have mine, Surah 109. So those surahs would seem to indicate that it doesn't matter what you believe and we can live peacefully together. But then, of course, you have other surahs like this, Surah 9, 29. Fight those people of the book who do not truly believe in God in the last day until they pay the tax promptly and agree to submit. It's a different picture, isn't it? Or this, also from Surah 2. Fighting has been enjoined on you, though it is hard for you. You may dislike something, although it is good for you. Or like something that is bad for you. God knows, and you do not. In other words, even if you don't want to fight, actually, it may be the right thing to do. So when you start to look at the Quran, there are some parts that are peaceful, and there are some parts that are violent. And obviously, moderates would want to stress the peaceful verses, and we see those quoted often in the media. And if you look at the writings and the publications of groups like ISIS, they would emphasize the more violent ones. Well, who's right? Well, obviously there's a lot of discussion on this, but one of the things that's worth bearing in mind is that in Islamic theology there's a thing called the law of abrogation. That means to say that those things which are written later, chronologically, in the Quran, override those things that come before if they seem to contradict each other. And the difficulty for a Muslim, of course, is that the peaceful verses in the Quran that we quoted come at the beginning chronologically, and the more violent ones come towards the end. Surah 9, the last surah to be written, perhaps the most violent of all. And so it would seem, according to the rule of abrogation, that actually it was the violent verses that trumped the peaceful ones. Now again, don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that all Muslims are radicals or all Muslims incite violence. But the question they would need to answer from the Quran is, if they don't think that violence is the right option, how do they explain these things? And the question we would want to ask is, according to the teaching of the Quran, who is being most consistent with it? So that's a very brief look at Islam, but let's turn to Christianity, because actually when we look at what the Bible teaches, we've also got a bit of a paradox, haven't we? Let's look at this verse from 1 Samuel chapter 15 in the Old Testament. This is what the Lord Almighty says: I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, put them to death, men, women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. It's pretty violent, isn't it? But then, of course, you've got other verses that we may like to quote more in church, where it says, here in Matthew 5, Jesus speaking, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So just as in the Quran we have peaceful verses and violent verses, in the Bible we have peaceful verses and violent verses. So isn't it just the same? Aren't they both as bad or as good as each other? Well, what we want to say is this. If in the Quran we move chronologically from peace to violence, what we find in the storyline of the Bible is the opposite. That actually we move from violence, particularly in the Old Testament, to peace. The order is the other way round. And if the center of Christianity is Jesus, and of course the clue is in the name, it's Christianity, then he ultimately is the person that we need to focus on the most. What it would look like to follow him. So what would it look like to follow Jesus? Well, we've already looked at this quote. Love your enemies, not just your friends and your neighbors. But let's look at this. Here's a situation where Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. He goes to an area called Samaria. They were a different religious and ethnic group to Jesus and his disciples who were Jewish. And these Samaritans reject Jesus and his disciples and their message. And so what happens? As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to totally destroy them? But Jesus turned and rebuked them. So what Jesus is saying is actually, that's not the way to respond to other religious groups when they reject you. James and John thought they were being super zealous by volunteering to call down some divine judgments. And Jesus says, no, that's not the way I do it. Or when Jesus was being arrested and one of his disciples thought it'd be a good idea to jump to his defense by slashing out with a sword, Jesus said, put the sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And then he healed the very man who was coming to arrest him. And then when Jesus is on trial and accused of bringing political unrest, he says this, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is from another place. He's saying, I haven't come to set up a political kingdom. I haven't come to fight. If I had come to set up a political kingdom, then they would fight. But that's not what my kingdom is like. But you might say, well, it's all very well for Jesus to teach such things, but was he consistent with what he taught? We're used to politicians very often, aren't we, who might say one thing and do another. Or maybe it's just because they're in the limelight. We can all do that, can't we? But Jesus was utterly consistent. Because as he's being crucified, probably the most painful form of execution ever invented, he said this, "Father, forgive them," the people that were crucifying him, "for they do not know what they are doing." He was prepared to great cost and pain to be consistent with his teaching. So then you have to ask the question, what would it look like if Christianity is centered on Christ to really follow him? Who is being consistent through history when it comes to the person of Jesus? Is it those who went fighting in the Crusades? Well, no, because Jesus said his kingdom wasn't a political kingdom that you could fight for with a sword. Or was it those who stood against oppression and injustice? And actually, the message that people like Wilberforce and Martin Luther King brought was this. They said, actually, the answer to oppression and injustice is not to get rid of religion, not to get rid of Christianity, but to get back to it. He said the problem for people in their day was not that they took Christianity too seriously, but they didn't take it seriously enough. You see, we talk about religious radicals, don't we? As if radical is dangerous, and often the way it's spoken of in Parliament is that way. Let's get rid of all radicals. But a radical is simply someone who goes back to the roots. That's where the word comes from. And I want to ask the question, if the root of Christianity is Jesus, who said, "Love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you," surely the answer is not to be less radical, but more. We need to be more like him, not less. And actually, I would suggest that even some of the people who have made great publicity out of opposing Christianity have seen something in this. Let's just look at three of them. Firstly, Richard Dawkins, no friend of the Christian church, really, but he said this: "There are no Christians, as far as I know, blowing up buildings. I'm not aware of any Christian suicide bombers. I'm not aware of any major Christian denomination that believes the penalty for apostasy is death. I have mixed feelings about the decline of Christianity insofar as Christianity might be a bulwark against something worse." Fascinating. Or Matthew Paris, who often rails against the Christian faith and religion in his newspaper articles, but in this particular one he said this: "Now a confirmed atheist, I have become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. I used to avoid this truth by applauding, as you can, the practical work of mission churches in Africa. It's a pity, I would say, that that salvation is part of the package. But Christians, black and white, working in Africa do heal the sick, do teach people to read and write, and only the severest kind of secularist could see a mission hospital or school and say the world would be better without it." He's seen something as well, hasn't he? And then just this week, on Wednesday, in the New Statesman, Tom Holland read a fascinating piece. Tom Holland is a historian. His books on history are well worth reading. But he's a secular historian. He would have, up until recently, distanced himself from the Christian faith and seen Christianity really as responsible for much that isn't good about Western society. But he said this week: "Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It's why we assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian." See, what he's saying is that he can see that Christianity has made a difference, and a difference for good through history. I want to say the Christians who've done good are those who are seeking to follow Jesus most radically and most consistently. Well, before we finish then, maybe I'll finish by asking this question. What then is the source of violence? If getting rid of religion wouldn't get rid of the problem, and it wouldn't, then what is the problem? And I want to suggest that the problem is actually, not actually Burger King, but it was in Burger King that I really thought about the problem recently. I was tucking into my burger, and I was looking at the piece of paper that was on the tray in front of me, and I read the Burger King slogan at the time, and it was this: "Have it your way." And it says, you have the right to have exactly what you want, exactly when you want it. Because on the menu of life, you are today's special, and tomorrow's and the day after that, and, well, you get the drift. Yes, that's right, we may be the king, but you, my friends, are the almighty ruler. I wonder what you think of that. I choked on my burger. I was so appalled at it. Because I thought, isn't that the problem with the world? Aren't we living in a world where everyone is going around saying, I am the ruler, I am the king? And what happens if we all go around thinking that I am the almighty ruler that deserves to have it my way? What happens when I come into conflict with someone else who wants it their way and our interests collide? Well, we'll fight it out, won't we? Now, for most of us, we don't rule countries and we don't have access to weapons and we fight it out with our words. But for others, it can become far more violent, can't it? But there is a conflict in the human heart that comes from this desire we have to put ourselves at the center. Jesus put it this way. He said, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. It's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evil come from inside and defile a person. See, Jesus is saying actually the heart of the problem is the human heart. And you can take away structures and you can take away religions, but the human heart would still be the same. And so the solution needs to be a solution that changes the human hearts. And that is why you will never change the world by force and violence. Because force and violence can change structures and political systems, but it will never change the human hearts. It's love alone that has the power to do that. And that is why Jesus Christ came into this world not to destroy his enemies, but to, out of love, die at the hands of them and for them. Because he knew that it was the greatest expression of love, sacrificial love, that could change the hardest and the most self-centered human hearts. And I would suggest that is why the message of Jesus can not be the problem, but the solution to our worlds. And has and does change people's hearts and lives through history and today. Let me just mention one, and then Andy might mention a couple more. Tom Tarrant was on America's most wanted lists. He was a very evil man. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He had murdered many people, and he had done it out of what he thought was religious conviction and beliefs. He was in prison eventually. He was caught. And in prison, he had nothing to do. But in his cell, there was a Bible. And he found the Bible was a great book. Not because he wanted to read it, but because he wanted to smoke it. You see, he had tobacco, but he had no things to roll the tobacco in. So he discovered that the pages of the Bible were actually just the right thickness to roll up cigarettes. So what he did is he started working his way through the New Testament, smoking each page as he went. Anyway, after a few days of this, smoking his way through the New Testament, he thought to himself, before I smoke the New Testament, maybe I should read it. And so he did. He would tear the page out, read it, and then smoke it. And this went on for a few more days, and he worked his way through the Gospels at the beginning of the New Testament. But after a while, he couldn't keep smoking the New Testament because as he read it, he was so struck by the person he found there that he was aghast at what he saw. He saw a figure unlike anyone else from history who loved his enemies and who died to change people's lives. And in that prison, Tom Tarrant put his trust in Jesus. And his life was transformed by the love of Jesus. Today, if you met him, he's one of the most peaceful, gentle, lovely men you'd ever meet. His heart was changed not by force, but by love. And that is what the Christian faith, that is what Jesus can do. But Andy, come and share with us about a couple of other stories.
Well, I left my friend Sinisha just in a bunker with his looking on his future as being absolutely destroyed, finished, no hope. And he, for the first time in his life, somebody who'd grown up an atheist in an atheist family, he knelt down in that bunker and he said, God, if you're there, save this village, save my life, save these people, if you're there. And if you're there, I'm going to seek you with my life. I doubt he slept that night. As the sun came up the next morning, he discovered that the whole front that had been facing him, lobbing these grenades and sniper fire towards him and his friends, had withdrawn. And he later heard from somebody who'd been on the other side that they'd had news of a massive attack up the road, and they'd all taken off in the night. And in the morning, just the sound of birds singing. And the war for their little corner had ended. And Sinisha travelled from that spot, and he travelled to where his girlfriend and his son were. And when he found them, he heard them explain that they had been meeting up with people who kept turning up and talking to them about Jesus. And they were passing to them just useful humanitarian aid. But whenever they did, they would stand there and say, look, we're nothing special, but there's a God who loves even us. And we're broken, aren't we? But God has come here and he's become broken for us so that we could be unbroken, so that we could have a future and certainty in relationship with him through Jesus. And Sinisha told his family, look, don't listen. This is something dodgy, something dangerous. But time and time again, they would come back just for the useful aid, but hear more of what these people were saying as they received these parcels. And to cut a very long short story very short, a night came where Sinisha couldn't sleep, and neither could his girlfriend. And that night, separately, both of them said to God, God, I realize that my life is broken. My life is distant from you. We see this violence and war going on around us, but right in the heart of our very hearts is the same motivation that's driven all that's going on around us. We need intervention. We need forgiveness. And we believe, Jesus, that you came to die even for us so that we could be forgiven. And Sinisha and Olya, we later became really close friends. And the reason we moved there into the Balkans, my wife and I, was to run a center where adults could study through the whole of the Bible in a year. And I love this picture because there's a girl from Bosnia, a girl from Croatia, a girl from Serbia, and they're sitting next to each other, and they would turn to you if you asked them, and they'd say, look, Jesus has changed everything in our lives, and it's because of him that we have peace with each other. Well, Sinisha and Olya now live in a city that was known for its nationalism, for its extremism, and they've been in that city telling other people about Jesus over these last years, the Jesus who changes people's lives. Do you remember that other person, Jelemir? He's strapped into a hospital bed, pumped with drugs. There's no hope for him. He's lost his mind because of the violence he's seen and the violence he's perpetrated. And somebody came to him and said to him, Jelemir, which means man who wants peace. Jelemir, let me tell you about one who's called the Prince of Peace. And cutting a very long story very short, Jelemir heard the same things that you've been hearing this evening about a God who is there, who loves us, who's entered into history in the person of Jesus to rescue and redeem, restore broken people. And Jelemir came to that place of trusting in the Prince of Peace. It's a beautiful name, isn't it, Jelemir? But people used to laugh that this man who wants peace, his name is the man who wants peace. He's never found it. But that day, as he met Jesus, Jelemir met the Prince of Peace. There's a picture of him here with his wife. And he is now the most beautiful heart. It's kind of reflected in his smile. And we shared a year of our lives together. And he then went back to his hometown, the same city where he had let that rifle off in the middle of town. And people would bump into him and say, Jeremy, what's different with you? What has changed? And Jeremy would say, let me tell you about the person I've met, Jesus, who changes people's lives, even my life. Well, I'd like to sing you one more song. And this song, it's called Lavish.
Lavish is a beautiful word. It means to excess, abundance, running over. And there's a verse in the New Testament that talks about God as having that character, a God who has such an abundant, lavish love that it runs over in coming towards us in the person of Jesus to bring us close to him. And this song is simply called Lavish. Lavish love that drives out fear, lavish love embracing near, lavish love, adopting love that calls you child, adopting love pure undefiled, lavish love, his love endures forever, and his faithfulness stands for all time. Forever love untamed by years, from out of this world love the life appears. Lavish love, forgiving love dies on a cross, forgiving love my gain, his loss, cause his love endures forever. Yeah, his faithfulness stands for all time. His love endures forever, and his faithfulness stands for all time. Life birthing love, his love endures forever, and his faithfulness stands for all time. Yeah, his love endures forever, and his faithfulness stands for all time.
Thanks, Andy. Just before we go to a break, just be worth saying, this love that can change a Tom Tarrance in a prison in America, this love that can change a Sinisha there in the Balkans, actually this love can change our lives. There are those here who would be able to say, actually this love changed my heart, and it changed the conflicts in my situations, and it brought love where there was violence, and it brought peace where there was conflict. And actually we all need this. Every single one of us needs this life-transforming love that Jesus brings. My question would be, have you ever discovered it? Not religion, but Jesus. Have you ever discovered the change that he can bring in your life? And why don't you, if you've not, cry out to this God, just like those guys did there in the Balkans, and say, God, come into my life. Come and change my heart. I want to get to know you, and I want to follow in your footsteps. That'd be a great way to respond. Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you want to say, well, I want to ask questions and I want to look into it more. Well, in a moment we will go to those questions, but also we have a course called Alpha that's going to be starting, we'll tell you more at the end, over the next couple of weeks. We'd love you to be able to come to that course where you can, over the course of a number of weeks, ask and explore those questions so you can really think this through for yourself. But of course, you may want to ask questions now. And so we're going to take a little break. Andy's going to play a little bit of music. And you can take these feedback forms and you can write your questions on it. Or if you want to text them in, the number's still up there on the screen. You can text those in. And I'm sure there are going to be questions that you'd want to ask off what I've said. Maybe you want to ask more about those bits of the Old Testament that we touched on so briefly, but probably maybe want to go back to. Maybe other things that you didn't understand or want to disagree with. Text them in, and then we'll spend about 15 minutes looking at those in a minute. But also, if you want to find out more about what's going on, maybe you'd be interested in coming to Alpha, maybe you'd like to meet up and chat with someone further, then also you can fill out this side of the form and just tell us what you thought of the event and leave your details. Or if you don't want us to get back to you, just tell us what you thought of the event. It's really helpful for us to have your comments as we do these each month. So do that now. Exam conditions are lifted. You can chat to the people around you and discuss with them what your questions might be. Do that for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll be back with questions before we finish. get him back.
Right, good evening. Okay, we've had a number of questions that have come in, which is good. I think they're still coming in at the moment. Conscious of time, so we will we'll go through these quite quickly. So the first question we've had, why would an omnibenevolent God allow war and suffering?
Yeah. It's a good question, isn't it? You know, why would God even allow all this stuff to happen? If he is God, if he is good, omnibenevolent, then wouldn't he want to stop it? And if he's powerful, then wouldn't he be able to stop it? So God could surely step in. It's a good question. It's probably one of the biggest questions. But my question in response would be, where would you want him to stop? Of course, we would like God to step in maybe when the situation in Syria or Iraq today, and when we see conflict on that vast scale. But conflict isn't always caused by bombs or terrorists, is it? Conflict can be caused by words. Conflict can happen between us. Actually, isn't it true that sometimes the people that cause us most pain and hurt aren't always terrorists on the other side of the world, but they're the people closest to us that are meant to love us? So where should this God stop if he's going to intervene and stop everybody when they're about to cause pain or suffering or conflict? Should he stop every single person? I mean, to put it kind of more lightly, if I was to go over and punch Pete, I'm not going to, don't worry. Should he cause my arm to kind of get locked in a backwards position or turn to butter as it's about to hit his chin? It would be a strange world, wouldn't it? It would be a world without war and conflict, yes, but it'd be a world also without freedom and choice. And so it would also be a very different world, a world where we wouldn't be able to choose to love either. And so, whilst it might be simple to say, well, just get rid of all the evil and suffering in the world, what would that mean for us? What would that mean for the world? And what if God was somehow, through the person of Jesus, creating a world one day where there is both freedom and choice, and ultimately an end to war and suffering? And that, I think, is what the Christian faith says ultimately is going to happen. God isn't going to override our freedom or our choices, but by his love, not by force, he's going to change hearts so that this world can be a different place. And actually, we've seen already some snapshots of how the love of Jesus can change a human heart in a way that force can't. It's a big question, though. I'm sure there's more that we could discuss on that one if you want to discuss it more later, because that's just a starter, really. Okay?
I mean, and linking with that, so you've got the question where man chooses to go to war, but, and you know, God, as you say, you know, gives us that free will. But the next question then links, why did God tell people to go to war?
Yeah.
In the Old Testament.
Okay.
So we're looking at it.
So that's a slightly different question, isn't it? What about in the Old Testament particularly? And as I mentioned briefly, but we'll look at it a bit more now, the Old Testament particularly does have times where we see real conflict, war, and violence. So it's not that the Bible is just a nice children's book. In fact, there are some bits of the Bible you wouldn't want to read to your children because they're pretty blunt and open in terms of the violence that's there. Now, I would say, first of all, there is no simple soundbite answer to this, okay? If you want a kind of one-line answer, I haven't got one. And it's a very big question, so my answer to this one might be slightly longer than the others, okay? But just bear with me. And I think there's a few things just worth bearing in mind when it comes to this issue of Old Testament violence. I anticipated you might ask. I had a separate slide for this one. What do we do with that? I just think a few things to bear in mind. Firstly, just because the Bible describes something, it doesn't mean it's always prescribed. So not every war in the Old Testament is prescribed by God. Some of them are actually in disobedience to God, okay? And they shouldn't have gone to war. But obviously there are some times when it is commanded, particularly the account of the Exodus in Joshua or the account in 1 Samuel 5 that we read about earlier. What's going on there? I think a few other things worth bearing in mind. I think technically what's happening is not genocide, an arbitrary killing of people simply for their ethnic identity, but judgments. God is saying there are some peoples who have become so evil in their practices that ultimately there has to be a judgment. And actually we know from archaeological research and other things some of the practices that were involved in some of these people groups. The worship of Molech involved child sacrifice and such like. So these were not just innocent, peaceful people minding their own business. There was more going on to it than that. It's also worth saying it wasn't immediate, but it was patience. In fact, we're told that God waited 400 years on one occasion before bringing the judgment that was due to come. So it wasn't a kind of snap decision, an instant reaction. God was patient in it. It's also worth saying that what happens in the Bible was very different, actually, to the context of warfare at the time. And actually, in the contrast to warfare at the time, it was often restrained by comparison. There's more that could obviously be said on that. Also, this is key, it wasn't inevitable but avoidable. The story, most famously probably, of this in the Bible is the story of Jonah. He's sent to the city of Nineveh, part of the Assyrian world empire, a very evil empire, kind of feared for their brutality. And he says, look, you're going to be judged, you're going to be destroyed. But actually these people respond in repentance. They turn from the way they lived and they change their attitude, they change their actions. It doesn't say they all became believers in God, but there was a transformation in their lifestyle that meant that actually they weren't judged in the way that they were told they would be. And so God was willing to alleviate or to not judge in response to a change of hearts. And I think another thing worth saying, not now but in the future, we today as Christians in the Christian church can't take what happened in the Old Testament as normative for what we should do today. We are not a nation. We don't go to war. The church has not got that mandate. That is not what we do. We follow Christ. But the Bible does say there is going to be a day of judgment one day in the future. And so actually, we should take seriously the fact that one day evil will be judged. And whilst that is a serious thing, it's also in some ways an encouraging thing, isn't it? Because it means that there will be justice. And actually, don't we long for justice when we look at a lot of what's going on in our world today? So that's a brief answer. We could obviously, people have written whole books on this, and I can recommend them if you want. Probably the best one, Paul Copan, Is God a Moral Monster? Particularly looks at the issue of Old Testament violence, and you could look at that in more detail if you wanted. Okay?
Okay, moving on from that, what do Muslims believe is the key to salvation? We talked about the number of incidents happening around the world and the violence, but what do Muslims believe is the key to their own salvation?
Not wanting to speak for Muslims, because actually the best thing to do would be to ask your Muslim friends, because not all Muslims would say exactly the same thing. But generally, Muslims, and certainly the Muslim friends that I've spoken to, would say, actually, there are things that I do, the 5 pillars of Islam that I do as a way of making sure that I am right with Allah, so that on the day of judgment, when He weighs up my deeds, I'll know that actually my good deeds will outweigh the bad, and so that I'll be okay. And that's certainly this idea that I need to do something to deserve it, which is actually how we think all religions work, isn't it? Maybe that's our issue with religion. We think it's basically all about what we do. I think the key, unique, and different thing about Christianity is Jesus says it's not about what we do, because we could never do enough, and we could never get rid of the stuff that we've already done that's wrong. But actually it's about what Jesus has done. Him taking what we deserve and then giving us what we don't deserve through His death on the cross. So I'd say there's a unique difference there. It's not about me being able to earn my way to heaven. I can't. It's about God making it possible on behalf of because of what He has done for me to be with Him one day. So I'd say that gives me real confidence and assurance, because I know I'm loved and accepted. I don't have to worry that one day God might reject me. But it also should give real humility, because I don't deserve it. And I'm not kind of going to heaven because I'm better than anyone else. No, absolutely the opposite. I'm no better than anyone else, but I've discovered someone who's willing to forgive and accept me. Okay?
Thank you. Is it okay for Christians to join the army and fight in wars? Are you condemning Christians who join the armed forces?
Okay, good question. Well, firstly, I'll just do a heads up and say through Christian history, Christians have obviously grappled with this. And there have been Christians who have been pacifists who would say they felt it would be wrong for Christians to ever join the army and to ever fight in wars. And they would hold that as an issue of conscience. And there are other Christians who would say, actually, no, we think not as Christians for the church, but as members of our states, in certain situations we can fight. And it does seem in particularly the book of Romans in the New Testament, chapter 13, that God gives states an authority to defend their own people. So you had someone like Augustine who came up with the idea of a just war. Not all wars, he would say, are allowed, but he says there are some situations and circumstances where it could be allowed. That doesn't mean that Christians who believe that it's okay to go to war think that war is a good thing. It's not. But in this broken world, sometimes they would say it's a necessary evil, you might call it, to limit further evil and further suffering. Okay? But Christians would have different opinions. I guess if we did a poll in this room, there might be different opinions on it too. What we would definitely say is, as the church, we have no remit to ever go out and fight for our cause through violence. Whether the state has that responsibility and whether Christians, as part of their state, can, would be something that would be a different matter. Okay?
Great. Now, there's a couple of questions here. We'll try and tie these together on because of time. If the peace of the New Testament overshadows the violence of the Old Testament, should we disregard the Old Testament? And how could we do this without picking and choosing the parts we like? Now, the other question was, it's easy to gloss over the violence in the Old Testament when you are in the love of Jesus as a believer. But what would you say to someone who turned their back on God because of the violence in the Old Testament? I know it's a very key issue, isn't it? So people who turn their back on it because of the violence in the Old Testament, and should we disregard the Old Testament?
Well, as Christians, we don't just follow the New Testament. We'd say we have a whole Bible, Old Testament and New. So although it might be simple and easy for me to say, yeah, just jettison the Old and just look at the New Testament, we can't do that because Jesus himself quoted from the Old Testament, and he said, I haven't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. But I think we do have to realize that although the Old Testament was written for us, it wasn't written directly to us. And therefore, we've got to be careful in the way we interpret it, not simply to draw a direct line straight from the Old Testament to today. We've got to draw that line via Jesus and see how Jesus has fulfilled what we see in the Old Testament. So we don't jettison it, but we need to be careful how we understand it and be careful that we don't just simply take that as a kind of normative thing for the present day. We live on this side of Jesus and we follow Jesus, not the Old Testament law. He fulfilled it for us. That therefore does give us issues, doesn't it? Because we have to ask, well, what do we do about those wars in the Old Testament? We can't simply say it was a different God because it wasn't. And I wouldn't want to repeat what I've already said, but I think I'd say this. Often today, the big objection that people have about God is that he doesn't intervene in the face of evil in our world. And yet it's ironic, isn't it, that our big objection of the God of the Old Testament is that he did intervene in the face of evil in the world. And so actually we can't have it both ways. Do you want a God that's going to intervene or a God who doesn't? And the Bible says God did temporarily in that particular time intervene. He doesn't now. But it doesn't mean he doesn't care about evil in the world. There is going to be a day of justice to come. I guess the reality is we like the idea maybe of justice, but we don't like the idea of judgments. But actually the two kind of go together, don't they? So I would say be careful how you read it. We don't get rid of it, but we need to read it carefully. We don't follow it directly today, but it does tell us that there is a God who cares about evil and injustice and will one day bring about judgments in the face of it. Okay?
And this is a lovely question to finish on. You said Islam goes from peace to war, and the Bible from violence to peace. What about Armageddon? The book of Revelation is really scary.
Okay. I'm glad you said the book of Revelation, not the film Armageddon that came out. So of course, you could say, well, isn't the end of the Bible the most violent bit of all? We've got the book of Revelation, and it seems pretty scary, doesn't it? We see this picture of God judging evil in the world. And in one sense, I'd say, yes, it is scary. And we look at judgment, and it's not that we find it easy or nice, but I want to go back and look at what I said earlier and say, look, in the face of the evil of our world, actually, isn't it an encouraging thing that one day God is going to bring judgments, that he is going to put wrong things right, and that evil people are not going to get away with it forever? And so actually, when I read Revelation, I read it as an encouragement. And certainly, Christians in history who've lived oppressed, persecuted, and killed for their faith in Jesus have particularly found it encouraging because they're told, actually, there is going to be a day when justice is done. And there is going to be a day when things are put right. And there is another message that weaves through the book of Revelation, and that is this open invitation that God makes to all people to come to him, to come to know the peace and the forgiveness that he brings, and to come to know the hope that he holds out. And so that's why the last two chapters of Revelation, you have to kind of keep going for Revelation. I read it again recently. You have to keep going, but when you get to the last two chapters, you see this beautiful picture of this world transformed and restored, with evil destroyed, and people from all nations and tribes and languages coming together to live in peace, in relationship with each other because of the love they've experienced and received from God. And I say that's the ultimate picture. Now, if people reject that and persistently reject that offer of love and forgiveness, then actually the Bible says it's serious, because God won't force us into a relationship that we've chosen to reject. There are consequences. But don't reject it. Don't make that mistake. Come to know that hope that he wants to bring. And so I'd say the ultimate ending of the Bible is one where actually there is peace that ultimately reigns because of what Jesus has done. Can I just mention one other thing before we wrap up? If you've got other questions about this, I'm sure you might do. There's a couple of books, well, a few books on the bookstall next door where the cake and the coffees are. Do head through and drink more and eat more. This book, Answering Jihad, is by Nabil Qureshi. Really recommend this. Nabil was a British-born Muslim, and he's written another book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, where he talks about his journey to discovering Jesus. And he's really helpful. He's very sensitive and warm and sees many positive things about his upbringing, but also wants to kind of critique what Islam says, particularly about the subject of jihad. And so this book is probably the best one on that particular issue that I could recommend. And so do go through and get that. And then more generally on these questions of, is religion a force for good or evil? John Lennox, the Oxford professor, Gunning for God, deals with that in a particularly good chapter in there. And I also, if you want to read a book written by me, don't know why you would, but there's one through there called What Kind of God? And that has a chapter on this subject as well. And there's a few others. So do help yourself to those books if that would be helpful to you. Okay?
That's great. Thank you, Michael. It's always very, very difficult when you put him on the spot, and it makes it look so easy, but just answering those questions, obviously, we're very much appreciative of it. And it just goes to show how it's so important to look into these issues, not just take, as Michael said before, the media side of things, which is often just one-sided and fairly shallow, but to actually look into the whole concept, the whole meanings of these issues that we've discussed this evening, and to really get to know and understand. If you've come along with somebody this evening, then do ask them those questions that perhaps you feel aren't fully answered. Come and speak to Michael. There are people around with the badges, the big questions badges. There's myself. Do please speak to us. You're very, very welcome. And it's an opportunity, as I say, to just unblock some of those things that we perhaps think, yeah, but I can't accept the Christian faith because of X or Y. And hopefully through discussion, and we can answer some of those questions. There is a new Alpha course Michael mentioned earlier, which starts on Monday the 26th of September at 7:30. A great opportunity to come in, have a meal in a very relaxed setting, and really discuss a whole range of issues that we as Christians believe, to be open and challenge, and hopefully, again, to get answers to those questions that you think, I can't possibly believe that. But Alpha is worldwide. It's just had a relaunch recently with Bear Grylls, giving his recognition to the course. Very powerful and very enjoyable, so we recommend that. And for the first time, on Thursday, the 29th of September, at 10 o'clock in the morning, we're running a daytime Alpha, and whilst there won't be a meal provided, I'm sure that with the quality of the catering this morning, we can hopefully say that there would be cakes and teas and coffees available. So thanks once again for coming along this evening. Thank you to Andy. We hope you've enjoyed Andy. Andy's coming back next year to spend a whole evening with us at Lansdowne. So thank you to... Oh, CDs next door as well, as along with books. I know Andy, very, very, very popular, so do have a look at those. But thanks again. Teas and coffees are now served with more cake, and we hope you've thoroughly enjoyed this evening and found it very valuable. Thank you.